Okay, there we go. All right, hi everyone. We are joined today in our series of interviews by Marjorie Perloff, who probably needs no introduction, but just in case. Marjorie is Professor Emerita of English at Stanford, Florence Scott Professor of English Emerita at the University of Southern California, an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Philosophical Society. She's a leading critic of modern and contemporary poetry, and her work has really been concerned with experimental and avant-garde poetics, and the ways in which it relates to kind of modernist and postmodernist activity in the arts, and that includes visual arts and cultural theory and music as well. She's written lots of books, many books, and the one that I think probably we at the Network for New York School Studies are most familiar with is the Frank O'Hara Poet Among Painters, which was first published in 1977 and then reissued in 1997, and for lots of New York School readers is really the gateway to not just O'Hara's work, but also to the work of the many artists and poets that he was working amongst, and that kind of leads on in all kinds of interesting directions for all kinds of us. And I remember reading it as an MA student and just kind of falling in love with the figure at the heart of the book, but also being really struck by the way in which the book was written, which seemed really kind of commensurate with this witty and intelligent and sociable subject. The writing seemed to really go along with that, which was the thing that I really loved about it. So Marjorie, thank you very much for spending time with us. Today.
Thank you, Rona. And I've long wanted to meet Rona because she reviewed one of my books. I forget now. Was it not Edge of Irony? No,
it was Poetics in a New Key.
That's yeah. Anyway, so I I'd never seen that name, and I thought, who is Rona Cran? Very interesting. And you had a lot of other reviews in the TLS at the time, and of course I've known Yasmine also for a couple of years. But have we ever met? I don't even know.
We did once upon a time in Oxford.
Yeah, brief, okay.
About a decade, more than a decade
So
ago.
I thought it might be interesting to start with just how I happened to write this book, because it's so long ago, and it's sort of a good story. When I went to graduate school in the long ago 60s, we certainly didn't read Frank O'Hara. I'd never even heard of him, I don't think, or any of the New York School poets. Ashbery was not known yet, none of them. And what we did read was Robert Lowell, Sylvia Plath. I wrote some of the first essays on Sylvia Plath. I still am very fond of Sylvia Plath. But I remember writing about Sylvia Plath, angst and animism in the poetry of Sylvia Plath, and on the bell jar and so forth. And so we read kind of confessional poets, John Berryman, Sylvia Plath, and Sexton was being read a lot, and all that. Never heard of who was Frank O'Hara? Who were the New York poets? Well, in those days, the journal Contemporary Literature used to have you do omnibus reviews, and they would send you 100 copies. 100 books, I should say, maybe 100 books, and then you could either throw them away or you'd have a big library and so forth, and you could do whatever you wanted. You could take 5 of them and talk about them. You could try to talk about more. I did one later on for them called The Corn Porn Lyric on Clayton Eshelman, where I was very mean to Clayton Eshelman and got in a lot of trouble, maybe for saying certain things. But in any case, in that pile of books was David Shapiro and Ron Padgett's the New York poets. And, and I just started reading it, and there was Frank O'Hara, and I just thought that was fabulous. A Step Away from Them, Why I'm Not a Painter. And it was the heyday of abstract expressionism. And it's very hard even to understand now how exciting that was. From Jackson Pollock to Helen Frankenthaler, to those poets, the first generation, actually, where O'Hara was really of the second for those people. But he wrote about Jackson Pollock a lot, and he wrote it. And that was very exciting time, because everybody was talking about, they may not have known the poetry, but they did know the art. Everybody talked about Rothko, Pollock, et cetera, et cetera. That was a very big moment. And a really great moment for first moment when New York art sort of surpassed Paris, and all that. Anyway, So I wrote, when I wrote my review, I kind of featured Frank O'Hara and I talked about some of the other poets in there, and not Ashbery, who was different again, rather different again. And so that was the beginning of my interest in it. And then one day I was in the Museum of Modern Art, and I saw the Art Chronicles right here, the good old Art Chronicles, 1954-66. And the editor of the New Republic, editing was very different then, in some ways much better, because there were fewer organs, but you could really write for them. And the editor of the New Republic was Doris Grumbach, who just died a few years ago at age 100 something. She was really quite something. And I said, I'd love to review this book. And she said, sure, review it for us. So I reviewed that for the New Republic. And next thing you know, I got a call from Michael Braziller. He was the son of the George Braziller, who had a big publishing house. And they said, how would you like to write a book on Frank O'Hara for us? And I was just a fledgling professor, really, an assistant professor. And I thought that sounded very interesting, but they really wanted a biography. And I don't really do biographies. You know, it's a very different thing. It is slightly biographical too. But I was in the middle of writing Poetics of Indeterminacy, the book that would become that, and which came out in 81. But I said yes, because I thought that was such a great opportunity. Well, then I had a lot of fights with them because I had to meet with him in New York. I was living in Philadelphia at the time, and they really wanted something else. They wanted a lot of gossip, and they didn't want so much analysis, but it worked out fine. And at least, you know, I got a chance to do a book. And if you do it for a commercial publisher like Braziller, it's going to be reviewed in a lot more places, which is good or maybe not good, as the case may be. Well, I worked a lot with Maureen O'Hara, Frank's sister. She was a great help to me. And I want to say, and I'll say it for the record, that, you know, now she's gotten bad press because of that book by Peter Sheldall's daughter. I can't even remember her name. You know, this book, which has gotten a lot of play. And Maureen sometimes has gotten a bad press that she's mean to authors. Well, she's very careful, but she knows exactly what she's doing. And I have great regard for her, because what she managed to do over the years is get the collected poems out from the California press, which then made a lot more copies than when Alfred Knopf had done it. And they did the great big book, but they didn't, you know, the selected poems really weren't very useful. We needed a different selected poems. And she, on the one hand, wouldn't let a lot of things be published. The letters have yet to be published. We all know, you know, what a problem that is. First, David Lehman wanted to do them. Ron Padgett wanted to do them. And she would stop most of those things, but she did that because she felt they weren't paying close enough attention. The notes weren't good enough. And we've had the recent case of Robert Creeley's letters, edited much too quickly after his death and kind of misedited. And with, you know, you don't know whether John is John Ashbery or John Wieners or who it is, and getting bad reviews. And so, you know, maybe Maureen was right to be careful and to wait. And Frank O'Hara is selling like hotcakes. It's a bestseller around the world. Just check out sometime. In Turkey, in, you know, you name it. He's really an incredibly popular poet. And so in a way, Maureen did know what she was doing, and she is very careful. She has really managed over the years to do very well and for him. And she introduced me to Grace Hartigan, who I was very happy to meet. And I went to her studio. Grace Hartigan was brilliant. I remember I said, I didn't understand the poem Second Avenue. And she said, well, let me help you understand it. And she went through it line by line. She was very, you know, really brilliant. And I met Patsy Southgate, and I met the second generation of painters like Norman Bloom, who was interesting. And of course, I got to know David Shapiro. So a kind of whole world opened up. And it is, when I look at it now, you know, it's a formalist book in a way I wouldn't do now. But the truth is, it's still, I mean, people are always now trying to get an angle on Frank O'Hara. Some of the angles I think are too bad, and some of the books are boring to me because and Maureen thinks they are too, because they don't, there's so much left to cover that isn't covered at all. I think we very much need something about the war, Frank O'Hara in the war, because it made a big difference, him being in the Navy, and therefore then getting into Harvard. And very hard for people to understand today what a difference the GI Bill made. You know, the GI Bill, which allowed both Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery to go to Harvard with Kenneth Koch, and allowed so many poets who otherwise couldn't have gone to any college, you know, go to college. So that was a big thing. And but anyway, when the book came out, I made maybe a mistake in the preface when I said I'm convinced he's one of our major American poets. Naturally, that meant that, say, in the TLS, they said, "Oh, Marjorie Perloff thinks that's so ridiculous. He's obviously nothing." And it's amazing how negative the early treatment was by other gay poets, I should say, and by gay critics like Marius Bewley, who said, "Oh, there are just so many balloons, or there's so many crepe paper streamers, and, you know, nice and all that." And there are other people like Donald Davy in England, who Donald Davy wrote me a letter saying, "This shouldn't even be allowed. The muse is female." And when you write things like, "I drink having a Coke with you, or I drink from being bored," Donald Davy wrote me and said, "If he's so bored, why doesn't he stop writing and leave poetry to us?" And so on. And the guy in the TLS just wrote a kind of scathing thing about how, not about me, he used most of my material, but how minor Frank O'Hara was, and it would all be forgotten soon. And that didn't happen. And so I was very pleased about that, to kind of pick a winner in that way. Well, then I got to meet a lot of interesting people through that who I hadn't known at all. And I was living in Philadelphia, so I could go up to New York and spend some time with David. Well, I met David Lehman, David Shapiro, Ann Lauterbach, and so on. And so then I interviewed John Ashbery, which was a total failure. I mean, John Ashbery did not want to talk about Frank O'Hara. He wanted to talk about his own work. And I took along Larry Kramer, who's a critic, who's at Fordham, and we both went. And first, John just didn't say a word. You know, we would show him things and ask him questions. He was very silent. He was very difficult. And of course, he didn't like the title New York School at all. He has a whole essay on that. He said, "I'm not a New York poet." He didn't like that idea at all. And in truth, he isn't someone, you know, he thought of himself as relating more to, after all, he comes from upstate New York. Yes, he lived in New York, but he lived in France for 12 years. He lived in Paris when all the New York stuff was going on. So is he a New York poet? And he wanted to be broader than that. You know, in those days, say Elizabeth Bishop never wanted to be considered a lesbian poet. There was no LGBT because she thought that limits her, and she wanted to be considered a major poet. And so did John. And that was always true for John. And after all, he was very much influenced by Auden, by Eliot. I can see all the Eliot references now, which I didn't see at the time, and were very important to him. And so he was very reluctant even to be interviewed. Then I got to be very good friends with him, and I wrote a lot on him. So that, you know, that was nice. But he didn't really want to talk, even though he wrote that wonderful introduction for Frank. He didn't want to talk about that. And he was also pretty cool about the other New York poets. Barbara Guest, he reluctantly would introduce and so forth. You know, it's always considered they were a crowd, but his one real friend in that group was James Schuyler. He admired James Schuyler a lot. But other than that, he really remained rather aloof. And so that was certainly a fact. And as far as the second generation goes, he wasn't particularly interested in any of that because he had really other interests and was the one poet who could bridge the gap between the various groups. Well, early on, the language poets were kind of opposed to the New York poets, and there was a gulf there. Interestingly, in recent years, that's changed a lot. And in general, as we get further away, we can see lots of other things. And I recently did a talk at UCLA at a meeting where Steve Axelrod and I talked about Robert Lowell and Frank O'Hara and all the similarities, and said that now that it's so long ago, you can begin to see that they're more alike than different in that the way they use detail, the particularity, the yeah, so that's how it went. So that's my background in all this. And then I got into it. And it is now, I mean, it's so long ago, that it seems amazing, but it was also by the 80s. So the book came out in 76, 77. And then by the early 80s, there was AIDS. And so there are all kinds of interesting connections there. Tim Dlugosz, who was a student of mine at Catholic U, and was quite a good poet, and Terence Winch, all these people, and Tim Dlugosz died of AIDS. And so that was the next twist on it, which of course then created a very different atmosphere in New York and all around the country. But meanwhile, people were really beginning to read Frank O'Hara and like him and not even understand why he had been so reviled. But that's because until about the 70s, poetry had to be more respectable than that. Richard Wilbur was a kind of king of American poets, people like John Hollander. And so anyway, so that's just my little beginning story for you. So I'll stop there.
You've said so much that we could ask about. I don't know where to begin. Rona, do you want to begin or shall I? Take it. Okay. Well, I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is that in your narrative, poet among painters, you're sort of a critic among painters in the beginning. It seems like, before this conversation began, we were discussing briefly John Yau's work and Joe Brainard right now. And he's also kind of situating Brainard as, a poet among painters, and he's coming from the angle of the visual arts himself as a critic and as an expert there. I guess I wonder how it felt for you in your own kind of formalist tradition to kind of broaden your lens that way, and if O'Hara was the poet that did that for you, and if you might say if your work has since not just been gratified by that, but if it weren't for O'Hara, if you would have gone in the direction that you've gone in your work, and such careful and useful attention to avant-garde poetics in the relationship to visual arts in general.
Well, that's interesting, but the fact is, I don't think my method has changed much. I really do believe very in close reading, and I still come across O'Hara poems that I find hard to analyze. I mean, I recently did something on Naphtha, one of my favorites, Jean Dubuffet, when you think of him, and it ends with, "I'm ashamed of my century, but I have to smile." And that's such a moving and very strange poem. It contains the line, how are you? I think I was made in the image of a sissy truck driver. And it's the kind of humor. I always loved O'Hara's humor, that he could laugh at himself, that he never took himself too seriously, as so many people do. And I still believe that even, first of all, I got to see that behind all that seeming casualness, it's my lunch hour and I go, those poems are very structured. They're very worked. He had studied music, which is not true of all the New York poets. And then ones I don't like that when it's just too casual, it's just thrown out. It's not going to last. So most of his, not all, but most of his work is in fact very structured. And I do believe you have to look very closely at the language. I continue to believe that. And more than perhaps the social situation in New York and so on. Now, did it open up for me? Yes, it did open up, though, the relationship to art, to the visual arts, which was so important then. But after all, that's not always the case. That was true. I have an essay on O'Hara and Jasper Johns. It's in, I don't know if you know it, but I haven't reprinted that because this sounds really silly, but I haven't reprinted that because I think it just would not please certain O'Hara people, because I end up sort of arguing that Jasper Johns, in a way, didn't have some of the problems O'Hara had quite in the same way, so he could prevail in a way more than O'Hara, who died when he was 40 years old, did. And but yes, I think in that generation, the relationship was very important. I don't think it's as important today. I don't think the art is as interesting today. I mean, maybe it's my old age, but I think in general, this is not the time for poetry that the 60s were. That was a great period, whether the Beats, whether the different groups, and maybe my favorite group is the John Cage Circle, which you can say is not strictly poetry, but Cage, Cunningham. If I knew anything about music, I would try to write about that. There really is no good book on Morton Feldman, Kate, that circle, and they were the real avant-garde, I think. I mean, because they were really different and are still the avant-garde because they're still not accepted. I still go places and the Cage piece is played and somebody will say to me, oh, he's a fraud, or, you know, who is this fraud? This kind of thing. It's still ahead of its time in a way. So more than the New York poets were very important, but I don't think of it as an avant-garde in the sense that they didn't invent. It isn't so much that they invented even a new way. They were romantic in a way, a new way of writing poetry. But I guess what was new was, first of all, the classes everybody came from. The sexual aspect is very different. The cultural aspect is very different. But let's be careful about that, because I think, you know, now everybody, like, I wish I could think of her name, Peter Schjeldahl's daughter, the one who wrote that book, is named, what is her name?
Ada Calhoun.
Yeah. This sort of, there's now this nostalgia for the New York of the period. Everybody thinks that would just be, must have been wonderful to go to the Cedar Bar and hang out, and everybody was drunk all the time. I've recently reviewed David Smith, who after all goes with that group. O'Hara wrote one of the great pieces on David Smith, love it. And I, for the TLS, just reviewed David Smith. And there was that cult in the 60s of, oh, New York, and we get drunk every night and we just party all night. And wasn't it wonderful? And all that. And these cold water flats, it wasn't so wonderful. It was kind of grubby. And then Evan Kindley, in the book he's going to write on the New York School, in the proposal, he has a little bit of that nostalgia for the New York scene. And he said it must have changed in the, it already was changing in the
80s.
60s. People moved to the suburbs and so on. Actually, that comes pretty much later. And it was because New York is so expensive today that nobody can afford to live in New York. And so there is that feeling about New York must have been so wonderful. But bear in mind that, for instance, John Cage used to cross the street so he wouldn't have to see Jackson Pollock, because he thought Jackson Pollock was such a nasty drunk, you know, very macho and nasty. And Cage would cross the street rather than have to run into Jackson Pollock because he was so obnoxious. They were really pretty terrible. So it wasn't all so sweet. And lots of people died of overdoses. And it now looks to people like this wonderful time. And at the time, though, it looked very different. You know, people couldn't get published. Don't forget, I want to bring this up. When Donald Allen published the New American Poetry in 1960, where you had the first print appearance of of Kenneth Koch, James Schuyler, O'Hara, Ashbeck, Barbara Guest. I'm not even sure he have Barbara, I can't even remember. But the point being that those poets, beginning with Charles Olson, whom he loved and I never cared for, and never could understand the fuss about Charles Olson. But those were their first book publications. Now, isn't that amazing? Today, anybody can get a book. I mean, there are all the little chapbooks. There weren't really all these chapbooks yet, or small press books. So most of these people had never published a book. You know, so they might have published a broadside or some kind of mimeograph, little pamphlet, but they hadn't published any books. So that was an amazing thing. You see, in other words, the poetry world was so much narrower. There were the big publishing houses. There were the university presses, like the Yale Younger Poets Prize, you know, and so on. But it was very limited. And that had good sides and bad sides. The good side was that if a book came out, everybody knew it. You know, everybody in a certain circle would know it. Whereas today, you can't even keep up with everything that's published, and it's so diffuse. But so that all changed, began to change, or you began to have all these small press houses. So as you all know, when somebody gives a poetry reading now, they'll be introduced and they'll say, so-and-so is the author of 15 books of poetry. And that's true, you know, 15 books of poetry, of which the best known are da-da-da. Maybe that just didn't used to exist, that whole thing. The Black Mountain Group, again, Ed Dorn, Denise Levertov, Creeley, and so forth. Some of them were published by New Directions. So New Directions did do new poetry, but only a certain kind of new poetry. They did the objectivists because they came out of Ezra Pound, but they never published Frank O'Hara, John Ashby, anybody like that at all. And James Laughlin was probably kind of homophobic, I think. And so, I mean, he did that. I shouldn't say that because he did publish, as long as they were in that orbit of Pound, he did publish a lot of poets, but he never had any interest in any of the New York poets at all. And he thought that was trivial and kind of silly and so on. So there wasn't, for somebody like Frank O'Hara, there was very little outlet. There was City Lights. Thank goodness, there was City Lights, which did lunch poems and did a lot of them, but not that much. I mean, there was the Beats basically, and the Beats had an uneasy relationship to the New York poets at that time, because again, there was a kind of feeling of triviality, no respect for religion, Buddhism, some of these things that the others were doing. What happens, of course, once decades go by, is things coalesce much more, and you can see the relationship between groups, so that Charles Bernstein can now be sort of on the same program with a New York poet, and that wouldn't seem strange. But at the beginning, they were enemies. That was kind of enemy territory. They were too casual. It was the natural style, and Charles's whole fight, and the fight of the language poets, was with the so-called natural style, which is the style of, say, Eileen Myles, second generation New York poets. So I don't think, in answer to your question, I don't think I just worked on different people. The world kind of opened up, and I had never really liked those other poets. Anyway, I'm really a modernist at heart. So I worked on earlier material. I worked on Yeats, was my dissertation, and I worked a lot on Eliot, still do today, to this day. So I guess I'm more of a modernist at heart than whatever.
I was thinking about, and this partly goes to the book of interviews that I reviewed of yours, what it might have been like to write this book about Frank O'Hara in a kind of very like male-dominated critical moment, both in terms of the poets who were being written about. I guess Sylvia Plath and Elizabeth Bishop may be the exceptions, but to kind of write out of such a male-dominated moment so kind of strongly and fiercely. I just remember an interview in which you talked about Harold Bloom apologizing to you for having been kind of horrible to you at a conference alongside Richard Howard and John Hollander, you'd been talking about John Cage and David Antin and performance poetics, and Bloom sort of had to apologize on behalf of himself and these other two, but the apology, and this is the quote from the book, he said, "I must apologize to Marjorie for yesterday because it was like 3 men raping 1 woman."
Isn't that incredible?
Incredible, yeah. And I just wondered,
today it seems incredible, but it wasn't incredible then. That was one of the worst things that ever happened to me. But on the other hand, once that happens to you, you can stand anything. So I was invited to this thing at I don't know if you've ever been in the Shakespeare Folger in Washington, D.C., the Folger Shakespeare Theater. It's a beautiful place to have a conference in a way, but very difficult because you don't see the audience because it's a real theater. So you don't see the audience at all. You just see black out there, right? And I'm on the stage and I didn't know who was going to all be there. And it turned out to be W.S. Merwin, who I once wrote about negatively. I didn't like his poetry that much, and such a fuss was made about it. So it was Donald David, W.S. Merwin, then John Hollander, who I always considered a kind of enemy. I mean, I didn't really know him well, but I didn't like his poetry. I didn't like his criticism, anything. And Richard Howard, ditto, who was very difficult, who was incredibly difficult. And there were a lot of fights, internecine fights in New York too with him. Excuse me. And then Harold Bloom dominated the whole thing. And he, Hollander and Howard, and so I was the only woman. And it was run by David St. John, who was my colleague at USC. That's how it came about, but I didn't know what it was going to be. And I did the last chapter of Poetics of Indeterminacy on David Antin and John Cage. And when I finished, there was a dead silence. And Bloom said to the whole auditorium, "I don't think this body needs its time wasted by discourse about such writers." Can you imagine? So, of course, my heart sank, and everybody in the audience sort of went, but I couldn't even see who was out there. And so I mumbled something or other, and I think it was that I said, "Well, we may have different taste. I don't like all the poets you like either, like Rosanna Warren, and she was out there, Robert Penn Warren's daughter. And actually, I like her very much. I'm not a great fan of her poetry, but I'm a fan of her as a critic. She wrote the wonderful book on Max Jacob, and we've since become friends. So I feel awful thinking back on that. But anyway, one of my Maryland students, I was teaching at the University of Maryland at the time, but living in Philadelphia and commuting. And he was sort of a leather boy named Donald Duncan, who then had a little relationship for a while with John Ashbery, I think. He raised his hand and said, Professor Bloom, don't you think you should move into the 21st century, in the 20th century? And Bloom said, young man, you have insulted me. I declare the meeting over. And he stalked off the stage. Can you imagine? And the rest of us went to the cocktail party. And I kept thinking all night of things I could have said and being humiliated. And they sort of tried to be nice to me. But as a woman, it was really very humiliating. And then the next day, he made that stupid statement about, yeah, it was like 3 men raping 1 woman. And I thought, oh boy, you know, it was really, but it was a sort of great kind of boundary, because I thought after that I could take anything, and I'm pretty tough. I mean, I talk back, you know, I don't let people insult me in various ways. So, you know, I never did make up with Bloom, and I didn't much want to, and I've reviewed numbers of his books. By the time he died, I think I was much less opposed to him, because at least he cared about literature, where so many people at the university now don't care at all, you know, and he had his way of caring about it. But I still completely disagree with his taste. As far as the women, as far as the treatment of women goes, I think I was kind of unaware of it during my graduate school years, because having gone to a very liberal college, Oberlin, and then a women's club, Barnard, I went to the Catholic University because I had to go somewhere in Washington, D.C. And they actually, that didn't go on there, because it was a different thing. All they cared about, you know, the religious thing. They were actually very respectful of me, and they hired me to teach right away. And so that was much less of an issue for me than it was for a lot of my friends who went to the Ivy League schools, where the professors would openly say things in those years. The male professors, like, women aren't as smart. If I had gone to Johns Hopkins, which was in Baltimore, which today, if you lived in Washington and you wanted to go to the top place, you would go to Baltimore. But in my day, you didn't do that. That's just too far. You're not going to bother to do that. But my friends who did go to Hopkins said those famous professors like Earl Wasserman, Don Cameron Allen, Leo Spitzer, they would just say, well, women can't do it. And my great friend, Renee Hubert, who went to Columbia, taught at Columbia, and worked on the French Surrealists, and she was a wonderful critic, and her husband was very good too, and he wrote on Moliere. He immediately got a job at Harvard. She got a job at Sarah Lawrence. I mean, where they would openly say at Harvard, we're not hiring any women. That was openly said at most of these places, but I didn't run into that problem. So I was sort of somewhat unaware of it, I have to say, you know.
I mean, there's so many, like, I have a whole list of kind of more critical formal questions to ask you, but just as I just have to ask on this regard, how and when did you get the guts to start talking back? I mean, you know, now I would never think of you as someone who would withstand the kind of treatment that you had to deal with at that time.
Well, I got it anyway, because I was a late start. I had a peculiar career. First of all, I'm a refugee. I think that makes a big difference. You know, I mean, later in life, I now interview a lot about the Holocaust in Vienna. After all, my family was kicked out of Vienna. We left from one day to the next. We left everything behind. We had nothing. We came to New York. I started public school. I learned English. Believe me, there are a lot of things that are worse than what. And then I had a mother who was a real role model, who was a professor of economics, and for a while in the United States, you know, had to go back to school and go to Columbia, but then she was really very successful, and she really taught me how to act at these universities. I mean, she, for instance, taught me that never accept going to all those meetings. She worked both at the National Bureau of Economic Research. That was her important job, really, and where many of the leading economists have come out of it, Tuesdays, Thursdays. And that was on Madison Avenue, downtown. And then she taught at Columbia. So on her National Bureau Day, she couldn't be at Columbia, and vice versa. So she just learned, no, you know, I'm at Columbia Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and I'm never going to be there Tuesday, Thursday. And I've had so many friends and so many students who don't dare assert themselves that way and don't get their work done. And I was always taught, you know, you have to do your own work. The most important thing is to get your work done. and you just do it, and you just smile and say no, and I never really ran into that. Actually, the only time I really ran into prejudice was when I went to Stanford. I mean, I taught at Maryland, that was fine. They treated me perfectly well. USC offered me a chair, and they were, I had no problems there as far as being a woman goes at all. And actually, we had plenty of women by that time. But when I went to Stanford, you had that Ivy League club. They had all gone to Harvard. That prejudice is even worse than any of it. They had all gone to Harvard, and they were their own clique, and they kind of looked down on me. And I needed, I think, 25 letters, whereas the same year, a well-known male scholar applied. He only needed 10, I think. This is the way it worked. And they never wanted to say they had hired somebody who had gone to the Catholic University and taught at USC. That was kind of déclassé. So it wasn't so much, it wasn't even so much as an isolated way, a woman, but it is true that these Ivy League schools, they had these male clubs. And if you weren't part of that male club, forget it, and I forgot where you went, Yasmine. Where did you went to? NYU?
Oh, no, I mean, I'm just thinking they still do. And sometimes the clubs now aren't just male, they're not gender-based, but they are clubs, like, elite universities are nepotistic to the core, and we could go on and on, but I won't. I think I was just asking how you gained your voice. Was it with your with the success of your criticism?
Well, I mean, I had a very hard, Poetics of Indeterminacy, which I think is maybe my best book and is still selling well to this date. It was reviewed by Wendy Steiner. Wendy Steiner was at Penn, and the first sentence of the review was, "One can only pity Marjorie Perloff for blah, blah, blah." I mean, you just take it. And when I wrote my Lowell book, I sent it, I was a nobody. The difficulty with being a nobody in those days was the men would get their books published because they had gone to Yale, and Harold Bloom would write a postcard to the editor and say, "Send to Hopkins," and they would send it and get it published. But because I never had any of that, I didn't have mentors who could help me because they were not known. I actually loved my professors, but nobody had known them. Dr. Giovannini, and there was James Hafley. So nobody knew them. So I had nobody. And I remember going to the English Institute in New York, because I was there with my children anyway, visiting my family. And I'd go down to the English Institute, which was another real inner sanctum. And I remember when, it was Jeffrey Hartman and Fred Jameson. And so it gave papers. Barbara Johnson gave her first important paper there and all that. And I just didn't know anybody. I mean, I had nobody to talk to. And, I was a complete nobody. But it's just your work. The only thing that will ever put you forward, I think, is your work, and you've got to do it and not cut corners and think, you can't. But of course, very hard when you have small children. That was very hard. It was hard for me. I had a very checkered career, so I was kind of way behind. On the other hand, what that meant is if you're a late starter, then you'd last longer. I think, really. I mean, I'm still invited to MLA things now, and so forth. And you last longer, where so many of the men have had real burnout, or people who started very early and then have nothing further to say. And you also have to have something to say. You have to have a point of view. And very often, people are they just write whatever the going thing is. And then at the moment, publishing is a very difficult thing anyway, because they don't advertise. That's my terrible thing. I mean, that, books come out, and very important books. I think, for instance, Craig Dworkin, who was a student of mine at Maryland, The Radium of the Word, that's a very important book that came out from Chicago, but most people just don't even know it exists because it isn't advertised. And the other one is called Dictionary Poetics, and he has wonderful chapters, say, on Tina Dara, on Black poets like Russell Atkins, and I mean, very, much closer than I mean, really amazing readings. And they don't advertise any of these books now. You don't see them in ads at all. Well, how are people supposed to know they even exist? Now, you can say in certain coteries like New York School, all right, people know each other and they publish each other's books, small press runs, but other people have never heard of them. And so I'll say to somebody, talk about something, and they have literally never heard of the writer, So that's very hard, I think. But I guess I was just, I don't know, people often ask me that, how did you dare speak up? Well, you know, I used to be chased home from school by these two boys. I remember them, Kenny Moynihan and Joseph Puny, calling me a dirty Jew and things like that when I was in public school. And my mother would say, just ignore them, you know, sticks and stone, etc. And your bones. And so I think I learned to toughen up pretty young, and I believe in that. And I think, therefore, with all the talk of microaggressions, what's much worse than a microaggression is a macroaggression. And after all, I was the victim of it, so I know what that's like.
Rona, I'm deferring to you because I could just keep going. Can we all just let out a collective moan for a moment about
Yeah.
the state of publishing and academia and everything?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I want to say one more thing about the state of publishing, is maybe you all have good ideas. So Alan Thomas, who's my editor at Chicago, is here, and I complained to him about, I mean, they do some good advertising for my books because I've been around there a long time, but they really, you know, didn't for Craig. Yunte Wang, wonderful writer. Yunte Wang has a book out called Chinese Whispers on Poetry, which I recommend to you all highly.
Mhm.
You know, has he advertised Yunte Wang's book? No. So I said, Alan, why don't you advertise them all? So well, people don't buy books anymore for their personal library. They can just use PDFs and pass them around. And I hate to say it, partly that's true. I mean, I've sent PDFs to friends, you know, it is easy, and then they don't have to pay for the book. So there's a reluctance, you know, to publish. And so therefore, then I know, because I ran the Northwestern series on the avant-garde, and most of the books in that series, and I'm sure you know some of them, and there's I think we have wonderful books in the series, including a book that is not known at all on Oulipo that's by a woman writer from Chicago, and I'll think of her name in a minute. But again, they didn't advertise them at all. They don't spend the money on advertising. And if they don't, then nobody really, how are people supposed to know about it? And there's so many books, you see. So
yeah, it becomes kind of hard as an academic or a critic to like maintain the momentum. I don't know, Rona, if you feel this way as a lesser known.
Well, you know from doing your book, you know
from
who did your book, Jasmine? Was that Edinburgh?
Oxford. It was Oxford, and they did zero advertising.
Exactly,
and it was £80. Like no one's going to buy that.
Brian Reed's books have just come and gone, you know,
Yeah.
very good books on contemporary poetry. And in general, I mean, that is, I won't do one for those British ones anymore, forgive me, like
No.
Manchester or whatever, because literally no one sees them. They don't even send you the book.
Yeah.
They don't send the author the book. They send the author, I don't know, his or her own essay, whatever it is. And so they're very, you know, they're very interesting things, but they just don't. And then you think, what does get noticed? Well, gossip. I mean, gossipy books, like that book on Peter Sheldall. That's just that got reviewed everywhere, but that's gossip. Books on the Holocaust are very popular, seem to get reviewed everywhere. I have a friend here in town named Carrie Patterson, who runs a press, if you know, called the Doppelhaus Press. She's also Austrian, and she does things mostly about European art and poetry and so forth. But she'll probably have to close down because she can't afford to do it. She's an artist herself, and there's just no money to be made. So I keep trying to think of a bestseller for her. I think if she could just publish one bestseller, then she'd have it made.
I think we all feel that way.
But I can't find the bestseller. I've been trying to think of one, and because there are certain books then that I'm looking to see what I've got over here.
You might have one around your shoulder. I mean, I think it's a bit warped for us because, like, for example, with Oxford, you know, I knew that if I did it with Oxford, I would have a greater chance at getting a job.
You would think.
I would have a greater chance of getting an academic job.
Do you have an academic job now?
Yes, I do. Yes, I'm an associate professor at Reading, but at the time I was, you know, like looking for a tenure track
job.
Rona,
are you teaching?
Yeah, I'm also associate professor at Birmingham.
Oh, well, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. But a lot of the way that we are kind of forced into publishing is on the basis that it will get us an academic job. So there'll be a great little press who might produce, you know, a fantastic edition of the book that you want to write, but the university is going to look at it and go, "Oh, I've never heard of them." Whereas if you send
that's right,
prestigious, then you've got more of a chance So it's
So you like kind of give away your baby.
yeah, yeah.
Like,
But you
here.
both have tenure. You both have tenure.
Yeah.
Well, that's
Yeah.
very good.
Sort
That
of.
that's half the battle. I mean, in some ways, but in the United States, that isn't even, I mean, that's not happening. People aren't
Yeah.
getting any jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Any
it's the
jobs.
same here. Yeah, we've been on strike for I think we've been on strike for something like 55 days out of the last 4 years, all because of these kind of
And at the
issues.
University of California, there's been the strike now.
Yeah,
And they did get more money in the end, but it isn't really resolved. Their English department has 100 TAs. It's so cynical. None of those will get jobs. There are, in the United States now, there literally are no jobs. You
that's
might be a
terrible.
lecturer. You might be a lecturer somewhere and make, $1,200 a course, something like that.
Mm.
And so nobody can live on that. And so people here are really, everybody's retiring. I can't get over, I mean, the number of people that are retiring back in 65, whereas they would stay much longer now these last years, because they're so burned out and they don't like it. And it's so difficult. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
So Alden Nielsen,
retiring.
who writes Black poetry, is retiring this year. Michael North retired. Everybody's retiring.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to stay in, I have to say. It's getting a bit disillusioning.
Well, creative writing, no, the answer is at Stanford, that's all. Creative writing is very popular. So they do hire people, but at Stanford, they mostly hire part-time lecturers even to teach that, and
You don't want to be part of that machine as well. Like it gets to a
it's
point where
really like a machine. It
Yeah.
is really, and at Stanford, the attitude toward poetry hasn't improved 1 inch. I mean, they always thought I was just kind of weird, and they like poets the most. Well, Louise Gluck teaches there part-time. I mean, it's very conservative. It was Ira Winter's country. And when I first came, I mean, you can say that was pretty devastating for me. I mean, they didn't want me. The poetry people didn't want me, including Denise Levertov, wrote a letter to the whole department how they shouldn't hire me.
Wow.
And I gave a talk, and she wrote to the department and put it in everybody's box and said, she seems like a very nice lady, but she's going to turn our students into little Gertrude Stein-lets. That's what she said.
Can you imagine how fun that would be?
That's what she wrote. She wrote that into little Gertrude Stein-lets, and she liked Zukovsky and things like that. Well, of course, that backfired. And then I remember I was at a conference, the great conference that we had in Alabama. This was way back in the 80s, where Hank Laser had this conference called, I can't even remember, but everybody fought with everybody else. There was Helen Vendler. And
wow, it's like the parallel of the 1967 Berkeley conference.
Yeah.
Oh, it was incredible. This conference was incredible. There was Louis Simpson, David Ignatow, and first they all attacked Helen Vendler, and they all complained they weren't getting enough attention. And then they got in a huge fight. He just recently died, Stern. What's his first name? Gerald Stern. Gerald Stern was so furious that he had to appear with Charles Bernstein, the young Charles Bernstein. Charles was about 28. And then Denise Levertov turned to Charles and she said, well, your poetry just isn't any good. Things like that. That was lovely. That's what went on. And Helen said that too. And so everybody was fighting with everybody else. And that was just kind of amazing. But they didn't really, I remember Helen saying to me at that time, then she wrote on Ashbury, that he was no good. He was much too difficult. And that isn't what poetry is, and all that. And now looking back on it, and this is interesting since Rona's your English and Yasmine, that it was really a fight between British and American poetry. I mean, after World War II, being an English major meant doing British English poetry. Obviously the Romantics were it, and the metaphysical poets, and everybody learned English poetry, and American poetry was a kind of sideline.
That's how it still is in some institutions, don't you think, Rona?
Yeah.
They never even read Henry James and I remember a British friend saying to me, you've never read The Girl with Blue Eyes by Hardy? No, I never had. And he thought that was terrible, but he had never read Faulkner or Henry James or, anything. So it was a British-American fight. And the funny thing is, though, and you can explain this to me because I don't understand it, that in fact, then later, some of the American poets, like Sylvia Plath, certainly, are much more popular in England than in the United States. Why?
Well, because of her connection to her husband, who was British. So I think,
was that why?
Well, I mean, I think first to answer, because
She lived in England. She lived in England.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think Rona is director of the North American Literary Studies in her department, so she'll have much more to say on this. But I think when I went to Oxford and I started doing my thesis on an American School of Poets, I was chastised all the time, and I always felt like what I was doing wasn't taken seriously. And I came to understand that the main belief was that American literature was derivative. And so that it didn't necessarily have its like own parallel literary tradition that might have been in conversation all along. In the view that I was meeting, it was that maybe American literature was talking to English literature, but the English literature wasn't talking back. So maybe American literature was in its own kind of imagined conversation, for example, with romantic poetry, like, modern and contemporary American poetry.
Right.
But romantic poetry didn't care about that's the way I came to.
And that was one of the great things of some of the New York School people, that it brought America into the picture. Jokes were made and all that. But on the other hand, it's still true that Mark Ford, editing O'Hara, has probably done more than any comparable, I'm trying to think, American as far as editing the material. And very well. So there's actually in Britain, I feel many of these people have been appreciated much more. At least they're reviewed. At least see the TLS will do reviews of various people. They always reviewed Creeley. I remember back then. I don't know about. They're not going to review younger poets particularly, but neither does anybody. Neither does the New York Times or anything like that. It's just hard. It's very hard to do, but there has been that switch, and it took me years to actually recognize that it was all British literature. You had to know Spencer, and I never liked having to do all that. I always wanted to do Dostoevsky or something, and do comp lit rather than have to do Piers Plowman. That was my low point. I had a whole course in Piers Plowman. That's, not my favorite. But anyway, you sort
I
of.
have to ask you a quick question because I'm going to have to run in a second because of those aforementioned childcare duties.
Oh yeah.
But I want to push this in before Rona, I'm sure, will close it out really well. And it's a compound question. This has been such a fun conversation for us because of the gossip and the academic gossip as well. And it brings me back to the thing you mentioned in the very beginning about people writing books on the New York School that are based on gossip or that are more interested in that kind of surface level reading. Which is really, really like contagious. And Rona and I are in the midst of producing a book.
I know.
So it's, we're guilty, but like happily. So yeah. And so and I'm thinking of what Ron Padgett once said to me in an interview about the difference between two kinds of criticism, gossip and nuts and bolts. And he says, they're both very interesting, but we have to kind of distinguish which one we're doing. And you're so good at the nuts and bolts. But around it, there's this kind of sense of gossip about the notion that, if you had to pick a school of New York School poets, you definitely would favor the first generation. Is that a correct reading? Yes.
Yes.
So, so I've got this pullout of something you mentioned in your book on O'Hara, which is that he deliberately avoids symbolic density in favor of literalness, improvisation, immediacy, catalogs of concrete images, racy, purposely outrageous diction, and a very loose free verse line. And I just can't help read that and wonder how it can or cannot be applied to the.
Okay. Yes, you've got to go. Let's be quick. Maybe I'm missing something important. I've never been able to see the Ted Berrigan Code because to me, it always was just an imitation of O'Hara. It's 10:53. And I'm screwing so-and-so, and I'm doing this and this, and it's not as well done. And it's just boring to me. And I know that's cruel. Now, and I like Ron Padgett personally very well. I think he's done great translations. I think he's a fun poet, but it doesn't, poetry for me is news that stays news. Let me just be as brief as that. Some of what's written now is not news that stays news. And it also has gone back very much to a kind of confessionalism that I thought we got beyond. I think Alice Notley, for it gets to be very personal and confessional and just not that well written. It's also a problem I have, maybe that's just me, with bad free verse. Free verse is now more than 100 years old. Okay, it was great to get free verse and get away from systems. But on the other hand, I'm practically looking for, it would be nice to have something that has some structure and doesn't just sort of go on and on and on.
But what if its structure is invisible?
And I don't think there's enough structure in a lot of it, and that it's too obvious and fun to listen to, but not news that stays news and not good at rereading. So I don't think it's, to me, probably the most interesting poetry today would be one you're not so into, which is concrete poetry or visual poetry, where there's been wonderful work done. And it goes with the times and the digital times and so forth. So that, no, I'm not a great fan. I know that's awful to say here, and it's going to be awful, but people hate me anyway, so it's all right. That the second, I don't think the second generation is as interesting, and that's true in the visual arts too. Larry Rivers, if I never saw another Larry Rivers, that would be fine.
But Joe Brainard's second generation, right?
He's the exception.
Yeah.
He's really the exception. I don't think most of those men, like Larry Rivers, were particularly good. They were okay. Or Norman Bloom, and nobody looks at them either. Let's get real. They're not studied anymore. Nobody really, okay, Joan Mitchell. There's a big fuss about Joan Mitchell today, partly because she's a woman, and she is good. I think Joan Mitchell is very good. But on the whole, the second generation wasn't as interesting as so often a second generation is, like second generation surrealists. So I know that's heresy for you two, but anyway.
I mean, I think my whole book was devoted to trying to argue that there was structure in second generation poetry, but I might still have work to do.
In Joe Brainard, there certainly is. I mean, I've written on Joe Brainard. I did a big piece on him. Yeah, I think Joe Brainard really is. Certainly there is structure, but as I say, Ted, the one that I never could cotton up to that much was Ted Berrigan. I feel the same way about the second generation of the Ashbery followers. The same thing happened. Look at Douglas Creasy. Douglas Creasy won all kinds of awards and was considered almost as good as John Ashbery. I can see you're practically drawing a blank on Douglas Creasy. Yasmine, are you?
I have no idea who he is. No,
you see what I mean? Douglas Creasy was considered very important, sort of second, a follower of Ashbery's, along with the clique was John Yao, as a matter of fact, was in that clique. John Yao, Marjorie Perloff, Ann Lauterbach. It was a real clique. They met all the time. David Lehman, David Shapiro, and there were one or two more. And that was the Tribe of John. Susan Schultz wrote a book called The Tribe of John. Yeah.
I'm so sorry that I have to go, but you're making me think that the follow-up to our oral history of the New York School poets should be an oral history of the New York School critics. I think I'm just going to leave that there. And I'm sure.
Anyway, I like the website very much, and I'm learning things, and I sort of feel badly. I don't know some of those people better. So
well, we'll make that.
It's a two-way process. Yeah. Thank you, Jasmine.
It was so nice seeing you.
Nice to see you. Yeah.
See you, lady.
And we have to go. Yeah. Don't we?
We'll wrap up in just a few moments. I just wanted to a kind of comment. I'm really interested in the ways in which the gossip and the nuts and bolts kind of come together in critical writing, and that there's some poets or writers who you just for some reason can't get along with, and yet we can't kind of get rid of them. And I'm really interested in the ways in which I gut responses to some of these poets, Berrigan, O'Hara, Ashbery. They kind of feel so real, and then when you come to read them, they sort of start to slip in different kind of directions. So I'm really just struck by the way in which, no matter how much you try and concentrate on the literature, the personality kind of comes through as in these really interesting ways.
Yeah, well, I think I like Anne Waldman much better than I did in the past. It's very interesting that Anne Waldman, when she was part of the Beats, there was all that drum beating for everybody out in Naropa. I went to Naropa, and all that, and Ferlinghetti and Corso. Enough of that, really. Yeah. I think there are few. I think Ginsberg and Kerouac are the two major beats, but all that. And so since she was sort of the queen of the beats, I never paid that much attention. But now that then I went to a conference in China, and Anne Waldman was there, and she was quite marvelous, and also quite marvelous in her commentary. Yeah. And so I started to take her much more seriously. So, everything is a matter also of how you, I don't know how you first got interested in New York poetry. How was that?
I was at UCL, so I was taught by Mark Ford. So yeah,
Oh,
so I was very lucky to meet someone like that. So that was how I encountered Frank
because I
O'Hara.
always wondered about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So many, and the language poets, of course, were never liked in England, still aren't, right? I mean, Jim Campbell, who was my editor at the TLS, always said, give it up, Marjorie,
Mm,
even Susan Howe, you've never,
mm,
yeah. I mean, to me, Susan Howe is maybe to me, the great American poet now in many
yeah.
ways,
Yeah.
but a lot of people don't feel that way. And she doesn't get included in anthologies because her work is too long. It doesn't really
Yeah.
anthologize. That's another big thing. What anthologizes well and what doesn't.
Yeah. Same with
I-
Anne Waldman, because she was saying to Yasmine recently that she feels understudied. And part of that is because her work is so long. And it's very difficult for people to break it into,
That's right.
teachable chunks or
Yeah.
anthologizable chunks.
Yeah. Right.
Mm.
Right.
Um, but yeah, and just before we finish, the other thing that kind of struck me out of what we were talking about was reading, and the way in which the New York school kind of takes shape through what people read. The poet Kimberly Lyons was talking about this recently, that there's this kind of network that goes beyond the personalities. That she was saying, she came to the New York school through reading, and she has this huge list of recommendations of poets that she reads now. Same with Leanne Brown. Leanne has all these kind of recommendations. Oh, if you like Frank O'Hara, read, this poet, Ariana Rines. She's kind of got these recommendations that the New York school in its, third generation, fourth generation, fifth generation seems to kind of exist because of what people read rather than because of these kind of
Well,
personalities or
that's interesting, but then the issue comes up, why do they read that?
Mm,
I mean, first of all, there were people sort of in the New York school in a way, like John Wieners, who's
yeah,
died dead now, who never lived in New York and lived in Boston. And on the other hand, Kenneth Koch, who was sort of the king and did teach at Columbia. But I was never much of many of us were never really great fans of Kenneth Koch. I don't dislike him, but it
mm,
all seems a little bit, not very, it doesn't, for instance, one thing that both O'Hara and Ashbery turned out to have is also a real sense of the tragic of the war, the Cold War, that the arrow that flieth by day, those poems. Yeah, we have to go. Cold War poems and so forth, that they weren't all jokey. And Kenneth Koch always seemed to me wouldn't really even get himself to want to go beyond the jokey.
yeah,
And so that for me, that's limited, but many of those
yeah,
things are personal. And the things you read, you have to be careful about, because I remember Williams, the poets William Carlos Williams loved were Eli Siegel. They're all poets
right,
nobody of today. And
yeah,
so, I mean, poets like people, and so John Ashbery had very odd taste, and he didn't like
yeah,
most of the major figures at all. And he would love somebody, I can't even think of who, that you never would have heard of. So
yeah, yeah,
that's because they can draw something from that.
yeah, yeah,
I
yeah,
don't know, as scholars, I would say, or as critics, I don't know that we can follow that. Maybe, I don't know.
yeah, yeah. It takes a lot of time
Yeah.
and energy.
Can I just ask you, are you writing a book now?
I'm writing a book. It's called Everyday Rebellion, and it's about New York poetry and kind of everyday resistance between the 60s and the 80s.
Oh, that
So
should be
thinking
great.
about
Yeah.
gender and the AIDS crisis um, and race and so on. Yeah, it's fun. It's good fun. But
Good.
I need to
I
finish
look
it. I
forward
need
to
to
it.
do what you recommended and smile and say no.
You
More
do.
often.
You really do. I think that's the lesson I try to teach my female graduate students. When people get to be associate professors and then they don't get to be full professors,
Mm,
to be a big topic at the MLA. Why do women get stuck in that role? And we do have to say, no, the men say do it all the time. They just say, no, I can't come to that meeting, or I'm not going to be there. And meetings, especially, most of them are a complete waste of time,
mm,
do without them. And yeah, you should certainly
absolutely.
just say no. No, just say no,
Smile
because
and say
it
no.
just happened with my mother that she had that other job, but we have another job really too. And we just have to say, no, I'm not going to come in on Tuesday and whatever day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's brilliant advice. We're super
Don't
critical.
let the men do, yeah. Well, you do still have mostly a male department. Most of the departments now are largely female, though, no?
Yeah, ours
Yeah.
is. Ours is for sure, but certainly the kind of the caring responsibilities fall disproportionately on female professors. So we're the ones looking after students with mental health crises, which all of them have. At the
Really?
moment. Yeah, we're the ones sort of doing that sort of pastoral labor that's very much invisible and doesn't lead to publications and promotion. Leads to, you know, you feel good about yourself at the end of the day, but beyond that.
Yeah, but you do a lot, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
well, lovely meeting you, Rona.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you too, Marjorie. Thank you so much.
thank you so
for
much.
talking to us,
Okay,
for taking the time.
okay,
And we look forward to whatever it is you're going to do next.
thank you,
All
thanks.
right. Take
Bye-bye.
care. Bye.
Bye.